Okay, today we're going to talk about the colored slips that we have in the studio. They are in bins like this. You can see it says decorating slip, red. This is a porcelain clay that has been watered down into a slip consistency, and then every color has a different stain, and we use mason stains. This particular mason stain is a 6021, and it's just an identifying number. But we have several different colors, and they are usually stored on the shelves over by the extruder or on a shelf over the sink in the main studio. The important thing to know about this is that the colors do shift slightly, so there is a color chart on the wall over close to where these are stored. And they are, it's made out of clay. It's porcelain clay. So at this point in your understanding of clay, you probably know that when you have wet clay and you're going to put it on top of something else, this also needs to be wet. So this cannot be bone dry, it cannot be bisque fired or high fired or anything like that. When we're taking this wet clay and we're going to put it onto another clay object, this needs to either be wet or it can be up to leather hard. It cannot be bone dry though again. So that's really important. If you try to put it on something that's too dry or it's fired, since this is clay, it'll shrink and it'll crack off. And so it's important that we try to get these two to shrink together. Since this object is shrinking, this is going to shrink. We want them to shrink together. Okay, so the way that we apply this is we just use a brush. So in your kit, you will have a brush sort of like this. You can use a smaller brush or anything that you'd like. I'm going to apply the slip over the whole thing here, so that's why I'm using this wide brush. If you're going to do some brush strokes or more expressive line, you might want to have one of your the narrower bamboo brush. But since I'm going to cover this whole thing, I'm going to use this brush. The other thing is that when you open these, you will often see the slip like this, where there's some discoloration, and that's this is not there's nothing wrong with this slip. We just need to mix it up a little bit, and so I just usually just take the brush and just mix it up. If you find that there are a lot of clumps or there's something really dramatically wrong, if you're seeing it's just really stiff or really wet, again, let me know or let one of the advanced students know. So just mix it up really well, and then what you want to do is you're going to take the surface that you are going to apply it to, and you just brush it on like that. What I try to do is try to kind of flow it on there so it's a little bit on the thick side. You don't want it so thick that it could chip off later, but you don't want it so thin that you could see through it. In the firing, like I said, they will kind of shift colors just a little bit, and so you want to make sure you get a good coat if your goal is to coat all the way through like this. Okay, so you can kind of see I'm sort of just flowing it on there a couple different directions, and so that would be a nice coat there. If you wanted to layer the slips, what you would need to do is make sure that this is dry, and then do another layer. So so that's how you would apply the slips. The other thing that I wanted to show you with the slips, and one of the things that makes these really interesting, is that you can also cut through them to expose a layer of clay underneath. And so that technique is called Sgraffito. So anytime you have a layer of a slip, a colored slip like this, and then you have the clay underneath it, and you're going to cut through it to reveal that color, that's a technique called Sgraffito. And there are lots of different tools that you can use for Sgraffito. You can use something like like the skewer stick here to do some fine lines. You can use this end here, and that will make a broader kind of straight line. Well, you could curve it too, but this will make a broad wide line. And then you could use a trimming tool. I would recommend the smaller tool. I don't happen to have one of those small tools in this particular studio here, so I'm going to show you how to do the same thing with this tool here. These are typically more of a throwing tool, but they work well here too. Oftentimes you'll see in the studio too, we have smaller ones that are kind of crimped down so that line is even smaller. And so all three of these different tools will make really different lines in this, you know, when I go to cut through it. So, and so this particular line is going to be, you know, pretty thin and small. If you want thin lines like this, what you would do is, you know, make that line and then don't try to take those off when the clay is wet. Wait for that to dry so that they break off rather than getting smushed back into the clay. You know, if I try to take those off now, they'll get smushed in there. Okay, so the other thing I should say is that this is the same slip here that I applied to the same type of clay, but this sat overnight and I loosely covered it. So I had it on a piece of plastic, I loosely put some plastic over it, and let it dry overnight. So it's, you know, I could scratch through it with my fingernail, but I can put my finger on it and it doesn't smudge off. Okay, so this tool would do another line like that. The other thing I should say is that this is a good example of that you know, you can scrape it all off, or you can scrape, you know, some of it off here. So you can see there as the pressure let up, you know, it kind of has a nice fade here now. So, and then you can come back and you can make a line like that and cut this back. And, well, let me just show you this tool first. So, so this would cut another type of line in there too. So you can kind of see, this is a really groggy clay, so that's why it's really rough there. But if you had a line, something like this, you could come back and you could cut just on this side, almost like you're making a woodblock cut or something. Like that, and then you could use this as almost a template. And of course you could leave those cut marks if you like that sort of, almost looks like cut wood, you know, or come back and smooth that out. And then you would have your, you know, this line here, this shape now. So this line has now become a shape, you know, in the form. So there's lots of things you can do. You can layer the slips and then cut through, and you'll be able to see different colors here as you cut through. You know, so if I were to do this where I had two different slips here, I could cut through and there would be two different colors here. So again, just remember that these colors are going to shift slightly during the firing process. If you look at the test tiles on the wall, you'll see that the test tiles are kind of vertical like this, and you'll see that the bottom of the test tile is really shiny and the top is more of a matte surface. That's because the bottom of each test tile has clear glaze on it. And so you can see the difference between using a clear glaze over this as opposed to just having this exposed in the firing. The other thing I'll say is that you, in addition to clear glaze, you could use any of the other glazes in the shop. So since this is clay, it can be glazed over. So for example, I could come back with a glaze and paint a glaze just here if I wanted to, and maybe use a stain here if I wanted to accentuate that texture. So that way I could have a really shiny, bright surface next to a really dark, kind of rustic, kind of wood-like surface here. So it really brings in a lot of different possibilities for brighter colors, and brings in the type of colors that oftentimes are hard to get with some of the shop glazes that we have. So so that's how you use the slips. Just remember that when you're done, you want to really clean off your brush really well, and always make sure that the lid on these is really tight, like that. Okay, make sure it snaps down there because we don't want that to dry out. So once you get everything cleaned up, then you're ready to let this set aside to dry. I would also recommend that when it's wet like this, you don't want to touch it too soon or else it'll get off on your finger there. So try to, like when I let this set up overnight, I waited for it to get a little bit stiff before I put the plastic on. If you put the plastic on right away, you'll get the texture of the plastic in that slip. So anyway, that's how you use the slips. Have a good time with them and experiment with them and see what you can do.